Hello and welcome to this round 4 here at Pro Tour Shadows over Innistrad. I'm Tim Willoughby, here with R&D member Ian Duke, and as much fun as it would be for us to sit around and talk for a little bit, I'm far more excited to get down to the feature match area because this is the very first round of Constructed here at this Pro Tour, and we've got some spicy decks to bring you. Welcome to round 4 here at the Pro Tour here in Madrid, Spain. We have our very first round of constructed play here. I'm Tim Willoughby, joined by R&D member Ian Duke, and we have a fantastic match to kick you off with. Brian Kibler, he said that the last time he went 3-0 in a draft was the last Pro Tour that he won, and he's here with a very exciting deck indeed that we'll see soon enough. His opponent, though, current leader in the Draft Master race, Thiago Saporito of Brazil. He's come along with something kind of interesting too. I mean, this is a big format for Constructed right now. There have been a number of changes since we've last seen Standard at the Pro Tour.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Tim. The biggest one of which I think is the rotation of Khans of Tarkir and Fate Reforged moving out. So a lot of powerful cards gone with that, and a lot of stuff that was just underneath the surface is now coming to rise.
Sylvan Advocate there, the play for Brian Kibler on turn 2, mirrored by Thiago Saporito, though he appears to be on green-white to red-green on Brian Kibler's side of things. This very powerful card from Oath of the Gatewatch, we've seeing a lot of play in Standard, but this is the first time it's really had a chance to break out at the Pro Tour. And a Draconic Roar revealing Dragon Lord Ataka there, enough to deal with Sylvan Advocate on Thiago Saporito's side of the board, dealing 3 damage on top, clearing a path so that Saporito already on 15 as he makes Thraben Inspector, getting himself a clue, but crucially here it looks like he might be short on lands. And there we see a little bit about what's going on in Brian Kibler's hand. It says at the bottom there, just under his name, he's on Jund. He is a 3-color deck, but right now both these players stuck a little bit on lands, so it's going to be a softly approach for each of them in terms of the early game. One has to think that that favors Kibler right now, given that he has those 2 Sylvan Advocates going on. Great on attacks, great on blocks.
Yeah, and it looks like Thiago Saporito sacrificing his clue, trying to hit his 3rd land drop, does not, and discards Archangel Abyssin, which allows Brian to come in with his 2 Sylvan Advocates, and Brian does pick up Evolving Wilds, so getting unstuck on mana a little bit faster here is Brian Kibler.
Yeah, I'm guessing that we're going to see Kibler here at end of turn fetching a swamp. At this point, it's more important to him to have access to all of his mana to play everything he might want to, rather than being cagey about showing off exactly what his deck's going to do. There we see it, all those unhinged full art lands there. Turns out you didn't have to go to Zendikar to find the first instance of full art lands. We can see lots of copies of assorted Zendikarites between Nissa and Gideon in Thiago Saporito's hand, but as long as he's stuck on just 2 lands, that's not going to do too much. Draconic Roar there, dealing with a Hangback Walker with just the 1 counter on it, so we've got a Thopter token in play there. The 1/1 flyer, just a speed bump for the creatures that Brian Kibler has going on. He would love to get more lands in play for those Sylvan Advocates, because they do get a lot bigger and scarier once he's got 6 lands in play.
And here's how he'll do it with Painful Truths.
3 different colors. That means he's drawing 3 cards, losing 3 life. I'm sure he won't mind. He's on a relatively healthy 17 to Thiago Saporito's 6. In fact, now 2 after those attacks. Fetches a Cinderglade, and this could be all she wrote for game 1 for Thiago Saporito here in a blisteringly fast game 1. Ultimately more described by mana issues for Thiago Saporito than much in terms of wild plays. We will have plenty more Magic for you very shortly, but before that, just these messages.
Unravel the madness. Shadows over Innistrad is now available on Magic Online. Explore the new set by signing up for Magic Online at mtgo.com. In the art of Magic the Gathering Zendikar, you can experience the danger and beauty of Zendikar like never before. This lavishly illustrated hardcover book features the award-winning art of Magic the Gathering and gives you an insider's look at the secrets of Zendikar, its peoples, continents, and creatures. On sale now.
Hello and welcome back to this round 4 here at Pro Tour Shadows over Innistrad. While Brian Kibler and Thiago Saporito on our main table shuffle up and do their sideboarding, we're going to get a quick chance for a quick look in here on one of the other tables. On the left of our screen there, that Raymond Prez Jr., he is playing a Collected Company deck, and his opponent here, Luis Scott Vargas, with a deck that he described on his excitement level for this Pro Tour as being about a 7. This is a black-green Aristocrats deck. Nantuko Husk, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, but there's some nice additions here from Shadows over Innistrad that make this deck kind of special.
Yeah, we do see a Loam Dryad on the battlefield there, which is probably a card that most of the spectators here were not expecting to see. I know I certainly wasn't expecting to see it show up in the constructed portion today.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those cards that helps fix your mana. It gives you an extra body on the floor, and there's a few cards from Shadows over Innistrad that are particularly powerful with it. One that stands out from Luis Scott Vargas' list to me is Cryptolith Rite.
Yeah, this is the enchantment that allows you to, it basically makes all of your creatures into mana elves, right?
Absolutely it is, and it looks like Luis Scott Vargas here. His plan to get lots of creatures on the board, though we see an Elvish Visionary. Some of the plays will look relatively familiar if you played much of the Collected Company Rally the Ancestors deck. This deck does get to leverage Collected Company, but it's a little bit more sort of straightforward on the ground in terms of its creatures, but for the fact that it has a few nifty tricks up its sleeve. We don't see any Westvale Abbey yet, but absolutely potential for that massive token coming out of Luis Scott Vargas' deck at some point. Right now, though, Raymond Perez, he's kind of fighting a fine rearguard action with the likes of his assorted Megamorph creatures. Den Protector there we see with its +1/+1 counter. Deathmist Raptor just waiting in the graveyard there.
Yeah, Luis's deck looking pretty impressive here. It's a choice that makes a lot of sense given the dominance of White Humans decks and Bant Company decks early on in the standard metagame. A deck like Luis's can really capitalize on that. It comes up the ground with lots of tokens. Nantuko Husk is a really problematic creature. It's really just attacking from the angle saying, you know, if you're going to play all creatures and very few spells and removal spells in your deck, I'm just going to have the better board state than you. I do see a copy of Westvale Abbey there in Luis's hand, so a potential win condition that you might maneuver to over the next couple turns.
Yeah, and there's definitely a lot of potential to holding it back if you can. If you're able to spring on people that 9/7 lifelink creature, that's certainly a powerful option. Here he does play it out because he's not got lands to spare, really. But yeah, threatening potentially making an awfully difficult to deal with creature very quickly indeed.
Yeah, the one thing you do have to watch out for when transforming into Ormendal, the Profane Prince, is Collected Company into Reflector Mage, which is a potential possibility. Although I think Raymond would have used his Collected Company by now if he had one already in his hand. But still something Luis has to think about.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, Luis has not seen any blue sources from Raymond Perez Jr., so while he may suspect that he's playing against a Collected Company build of some stripe, he doesn't necessarily know that it's going to be Bant Collected Company. Right now, he could be playing against a green-white Megamorph deck of sorts. Of course, Scott Vargas did make top 8 at the last Pro Tour, and very keen to run it back, not keen to end up on the commentary too much, though I'm sure that he enjoys it to a certain extent. Right now, though, he's just got a whole mess of creatures, and that Nantuko Husk just dominating every combat step.
Yeah, and Luis is in just such a great position here. He can just sort of chip away with his Nantuko Husk, forcing Raymond to block each turn, and just sit back on the Westvale Abbey. And Luis, he gets to be the second player to move, essentially. He has the dominant board state. If Raymond doesn't do anything, he gets to just keep on attacking, and if Raymond does tap out for something by chance, in comes Ormendal.
Yeah, the small points of life that he's paying to make extra creatures here, not a massive worry for Luis. He's on 10 life, which is a relatively safe place to be. These Collected Company decks, something that they don't do particularly well is threaten lots of explosive damage, but for Collected Company itself. And each of these Nantuko Husks potentially lethal here. A lot of creatures on the board that Luis Scott Vargas can sacrifice effectively for extra damage, though right now he doesn't really have a strong reason to. And that's the end of that game there. Conveniently, we are going to be able to jump back to our main match here, Kibler versus Saporito on table 1. We've missed just a single turn of action from Thiago Saporito, just getting down an early Oath of Nissa in order to fix his draws a little bit and revealing that he's found a Westvale Abbey. There we see Saporito's stats. Just 22 years old, but already a Pro Tour top 8 to his name. And indeed, a pretty exciting win percentage, 80, 55 and 1 overall at the Pro Tour. He's currently second in the Latin American standings for World Championship berth. And I'm sure that he's going to want to get back there because the World Championships, absolutely the pinnacle of professional Magic the Gathering. Just the one thought to token in play after his Hangerback Walker is dealt with a Fiery Impulse, but soon enough, more creatures coming along as there's Nissa, Voice of Zendikar, making some plant tokens.
And Nissa could be a problematic card for Brian Kibler here. Brian's deck rife with removal and plenty of ways to sweep the board, but he doesn't have a lot of creature onboard pressure at the moment to take down Nissa.
So it looks like both of these decks able to make tokens after a fashion. We see Tireless Tracker there coming down for Brian Kibler. That will mean that every time a land enters the battlefield for him, he's able to investigate. And given that he's going to be able to sacrifice a fair amount of clues if he has lands, that Tireless Tracker could get fairly large. But all the more tokens coming along from Thiago Saporito. He's now got Nissa, Voice of Zendikar going on, Gideon, Ally of Zendikar, making 2/2 ally tokens. This board getting very big and complicated, and Brian Kibler, he's going to need something along the lines of Dragonlord Ataka at some point if he wants to clear out some of these creatures here.
Yeah, things are starting to get really scary for Brian here. Tireless Tracker, a great, long-term advantage card, but a 3/2 body on the battlefield on turn 4 is not particularly impressive. Doesn't really challenge these planeswalkers in the way that Brian Kibler would like to.
And we can see that in his hand there. He's got Draconic Roar and Ultimate Price, which are both fine removal spells. Unfortunately, they don't represent particularly efficient forms of removal when you have these ongoing sources of extra creatures from Thiago before he even worries about what he's doing with his lands each turn. Brian Kibler, of course, one of the players that's been in the game for longer than just about everyone on the Pro Tour, initially playing in the Juniors division and having a fair amount of success with decks that he's built all on his own. And this deck, no exception, a Jund build that actually sports quite a lot of cards from Shadows over Innistrad. We'll hopefully get a chance to see some more of them soon enough. But right now, very much on the back foot, as just unable to get damage through. Meanwhile, Thiago Saporito chipping in for points here and there with nothing to get in the way of his Thopter. We see a nice little synergy with Evolving Wilds and Tireless Tracker, both when the Evolving Wilds comes into play, getting a clue, and when it's sacrificed to fetch a land. So Brian doing well on clues, just having to keep careful note on his life total because at the moment he can't really do a great deal about that flyer. And there is another Hangerback Walker sat in Thiago Saporito's hand.
So I think what Brian needs to have happen here is just to buy enough time, start cracking those clues for cards, and eventually getting up to something like a Radiant Flames, maybe leading into a Chandra Flamecaller, or else a Dragonlord Atarka would be his best play on a board like this.
As it stands, though, Gideon has decided that he's tired of just making tokens. He wants to get in on the action himself. +1 in order to become a creature and attack. And following up with a Hangerback Walker. Now, there's a Westphal Abbey in play for Thiago Saporito. I can't think of many creatures that I'm happier to sacrifice than a Hangerback Walker at some point.
Yeah, absolutely true. And Hangerback Walker, a card that's actually has fallen a little bit out of favor in the metagame recently because of the presence of Reflector Mage. But just a great fit in Thiago's deck with so many ways to boost those tokens and take advantage of sacrificing it. For example, the Westphal Abbey, as you mentioned. Just a fantastic card here against Brian Kibler's deck, which is really unprepared to answer it for value.
Yeah, Saporito's deck's an interesting one because in some respects it's kind of the latest iteration on a deck that existed before the rotation, that being the Hardened Scales deck. We've already seen Nissa and Gideon working very well together as both token producers and creature pump. But a few new tricks in the format thanks to the likes of Westphal Abbey and so on, meaning that it's very much a different build, and we see Thiago's dominant board enough to get Brian Kibler to scoop up his cards there. This match will be going to a Game 3. As you can see there, plenty more Magic being played elsewhere around the feature match area. We're going to get a chance to see a little bit of match from Matej Zadelkai on the back table against Paul Chion there. Paul on the same team as Luis Scott Vargas. Let's see whether or not he's playing a similar deck. It looks, yep, there's a Nantuko Husk, and alongside a Blister Pod, that's a nice creature to sacrifice for the green-black deck, but Paul very much on the back foot because there are 2 World Breakers in play, along with what appears to be Pyromancer's Goggles.
That's really interesting. Those are cards that you don't often see hand in hand, right? Pyromancer's Goggles you're used to seeing in a deck with tons of spells, you know, like blue-red, for example, or tons of red burn spells, but next to World Breaker, it looks like Team Eureka has brought a pretty interesting brew here.
This looks better for you.
Apparently has already used Magmatic Insight to draw 4 cards, Matej Zalkai. I mean,
Wow.
Pyromancer Goggles, it's fine when you are accelerating, but when you're additionally getting extra value out of all your spells, it's a big problem. And we see here that Paul Cheon, even though he's resolving one of the most powerful spells in the format in Collected Company, the creatures that he's fetching are just much lower impact than what this ramp deck's able to achieve.
Sure.
Duskwatch Recruiter there, the first choice. That werewolf does let him search for more creatures potentially on subsequent turns. And a choice between what looks to be a Nantuko Husk or what he's ultimately gone for there. A Catacomb Sifter for Paul Cheon, bringing along with it an Eldrazi Scion token.
Wow, and look how many cards Matej has in his hand still. You know, often when you're facing off against a ramp deck, they sort of expend all their resources just to get their first 7-drop onto the battlefield. But it looks like Matej's got plenty left in the tank. I do also see a Kozilek's Return in the graveyard there. So if another big Eldrazi can come out, that'll be a pretty nasty situation for Paul Cheon.
Yeah, now that there's Zilliport Cutthroat in play, there's at least the possibility that Cheon might be able to go for something akin to the old combo kills that we saw from Rally the Ancestors decks, sacrificing lots of creatures in order to get those Zilliport Cutthroat triggers. But with Matej Zalkai still on a full 20 life, that could be a tall order.
So let's see what Matej can come up with this turn. I do see a Dragon Lord Atarka and a Chandra Flamecaller in his hand.
Yeah, an embarrassment of riches here in Matej Zalkai's hand. He's going to be carefully trying to figure out what's the best option of a number of great ones.
But when it resolves, I can choose to exile it or not.
Yeah, okay.
So Paul Cheon just double-checking there exactly how the Kozilek's Return works, whether or not it's mandatory or not. It is a May ability, so Matej Zalkai can play an expensive creature, have the Kozilek's Return trigger, and then choose, yeah, I'm just going to leave it in the graveyard. I don't actually need to.
Go for it?
Yeah, in the past, we have already seen in this match Cheon making Nantuko Husk big in response to the trigger, and then Matej Zalkai saying, yeah, I don't actually need to use my Kozilek's Return now.
So a quick glimpse at one of the really powerful synergies there in Matej's deck. He used Pyromancer's Goggles to cast Tormenting Voice. And the reason this is so powerful is normally when you cast Tormenting Voice, you have to discard a card and it's additional cost. But when you're copying it with the goggles, the second copy doesn't cause you to discard a card. You just plain draw 2 cards off that one.
So the first one, effectively, you're using the Tormenting Voice and a random card from your hand to get 2 new cards. This way round, you're using those 2 cards to get 4 cards.
Right. So it would be a neutral transaction is actually putting you up 2 cards.
Yep. -3.
And speaking of going up cards, down comes Chandra Flamecaller. Looks like she is using a -3 to deal 3 damage to each creature on the battlefield. And now the ball is in Paul Cheon's court as far as what he wants to sacrifice, possibly to keep his Nantuko Husk alive, or otherwise get some value out of his battlefield. He also has, it looks like, a Cryptolith Rites on the battlefield, so he may respond by activating Duskwatch Recruiter.
Yeah, a surprising amount of options available here for Paul, considering the fact that he's tapped out of his lands, at least. He is also going to get quite a lot of scry triggers from his Catacomb Sifter, should he so choose. And I guess that sacrificing things to his Nantuko Husk will mean that the Husk is going to stay alive, and that potentially enough to hold back at least one of those World Breakers, because the World Breakers will be taking 3 damage as well, and while they're certainly large enough to survive that, I don't know whether or not they would also be able to survive a block from Nantuko Husk.
Sure.
I think Paul just sort of puzzling out the sequencing thing here. He does get scries off of any creature he sacrifices due to his Catacomb Sifter, but he also, it looks like, is planning to use the Duskwatch Recruiter. So just thinking about whether he wants to recruit first and then scry, or vice versa.
The scry first potentially making that recruiter all the better.
Yep, but on the other hand,
Okay.
maybe wanting to scry after he
like
does
usually
his recruitment to
Okay,
ensure
sure.
his next draw step is as good as it can be.
Well, he sees Liliana Heretical Healer there. That a fine pickup. Certainly better than the 2 lands that came before her.
Sack this. Drain scry.
So lots of triggers going on here. Again, each creature that goes to the graveyard is a scry for Paul and a drain of 1 life due to the Zulaport Cutthroat.
And sack this.
Sure.
Drain you.
Yep. 17, 12.
And it looks like the one creature that's not going to get sacrificed may well end up being the Blister Pod, simply because Paul Cheon would rather that it die and then effectively just produce a blocker for him in the Eldrazi Scion token that comes along when Blister Pod goes away.
Thank you.
Yep.
How many cards left in your hand?
Just so
One?
you know, Kibler and Saporito, they're just pausing for a second here. We kind of want to see how this game pans out. It feels to me like even though the life totals are comparatively high, Matej Zalakai may well be turning a corner here if we can get you just the completion of this one before we jump back to the final game of Kibler Saporito. I think that's what we're going to do, because ultimately those first 2 games really didn't take very long between Brian Kibler and Thiago Saporito. I think we can afford to squeeze in a little more magic.
Yeah, I'm certainly enjoying this match. Both these decks are sweet.
Yeah, I mean, Pyromancer Goggles has been around for a while. It's never really seen constructed play. It was only upon the release of Shadows over Innistrad that it first made it into constructed lists. But even the last constructed lists I'd seen it in were typically red-blue.
Yeah, and you know, Tim, that's one of my favorite parts about the way the standard rotation works, is it's not just that a bunch of new cards are coming in, and it's not just that a bunch of old cards are going out, it's also all the cards in between that were in and are still in now take on different context. So, you know, without the powerful 3-color cards in cons like Siege Rhino and Mantis Rider, other cards that were lurking just below the surface, like Pyromancer's Goggles, now have their time to shine. So it's definitely, now is a great time to be a brewer who's exploring new Magic decks.
It's a great point in. It's not just about the new cards from the new set. Even the cards already existing in your binder may take on a whole new face with the rotation of these formats. So Paul Cheon here, just figuring out what he wants to be doing, plays a Loam Dryad alongside that Liliana Heretical Healer, which Matej Zalakai knew about. It looks like the Loam Dryad effectively just fuel for the Nantuko Husk engine here. It's being sacrificed, immediately allowing Liliana Heretical Healer to flip. And now that Liliana is a Spark Ignited, a full Planeswalker, immediately -2 in order to fetch back that Zulaport Cutthroat. Lo and behold, we have
It's just easier to see from
a new way of making sure that Paul Cheon is able to keep creatures on the board in spite of what we can see is just a bevy of sweepers from Matej Zalakai.
And we're starting to see a little bit of a strategic plan coming together here for Paul. Bringing back the Zulaport Cutthroat kind of indicates that Paul realizes his only chance to win this game is to attack Matej's life total directly. He's behind on cards. Matej has a really powerful deck, lots of cards in his hand. But if Paul can just sort of keep chump blocking and keep his engine going, making tokens, making creatures, that he can eventually drain out Matej through use of the Zulaport Cutthroat.
And there's certainly a lot of power in the deck of Paul Cheon, because we've already heard that that same deck in the hands of Luis Scott Vargas has just won its match. Luis Scott Vargas victorious over Raymond Perez Jr. over on another table in our feature match area. I'm sure that Paul will be happy to share in that victory with Luis soon enough. But yeah, lots of action here in the feature match area. Will Matej Zalakai be able to overcome this board state that's gradually climbing back from the sweepers?
Drain you.
He's in Quagmire there being sacrificed to the Nantuko Husk. Already a 6/6, I believe.
This is an 8. I sack the Scion.
Sorry, 8/8, I apologize. And that enough to kill a Worldbreaker. No mean feat. Though the fact that Matej Zalakai can sacrifice lands and get it back, and in turn use his Kozilek's Return in the graveyard, means it's not even abundantly clear that Paul Cheon definitely wants that creature in the graveyard rather than in play.
We're on 10.
Yeah.
Oof, and there's a Kozilek's return from hand. That means that there's the potential to deal with even super large Nantuko husks if needed.
Sure.
11 to 13.
13. No, so you said
11,
down.
11 to 13.
Yeah, so it's going to be 12 to 12.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden it's 12-12 in terms of life totals here, thanks to that Zilliport Cutthroat, but the path now clear. And there we see Chandra making tokens, a second Chandra making more tokens. That enough to win the game for Matej Zalkai, and that enough for us to jump back to our main match on video, Brian Kibler versus Thiago Saporito, this game 3 for all the marbles. Looks like Brian just stepped away from the table for a second to get some water there. He knew he was on a little break, but he's just grabbing his seat again, and we'll get a chance to see how this match plays out. Just a little reminder, we've got Brian Kibler. He's on Jund. I don't feel like we've necessarily seen all that his Jund deck is able to do. In game 1, he was able to capitalize on a little bit of mana issue on the other side of the table, and in game 2, well, Thiago's deck kind of exploded. So hopefully this game 3 we'll be able to see both players with an optimal draw and some top quality magic here at the Pro Tour.
Yeah, even though we haven't seen much of it so far, I can assure you that Kibler's deck is sweet.
Yeah, Innistrad Den Wildborn, not necessarily a card we've seen loads of in Constructed thus far, and assuming that Brian Kibler can find green mana, his hand's kind of a powerhouse. He's got a Draconic Roar to deal with, Hangerback Walker, with Dragonlord Ataka to get extra damage in, and there's just a lot of value in that hand.
Yeah, looks like a little bit of a mix-up here. I think Kibler put the wrong card into his graveyard there. Should be the Draconic Roar in the graveyard and the Atarka in his hand. Looks like we're getting that fixed up for you all.
Nissa already down for Thiago Saporito, and that one of the things that this deck does very well, the green-white tokens deck, it can have explosive draws that just sort of feel very overwhelming, because a lot of the explosion is not just about putting a creature on the board, it's putting a threat on the board that threatens lots of creatures.
Looks like we have a similar situation to game 1 here, where both players are a little bit stuck on land. Fortunately for Thiago Saporito, he does have his third land, which is enough to at least get his Planeswalker going.
And in this case, Painful Truth's not as painful for Brian Kibler as he might like it to be, which in many respects makes it more painful, I suppose. Only drawing 2 cards from the 3-mana sorcery there.
However, good for him is he did pick up a forest there, so he will be able to unlock his green spells starting next turn, and that may allow him to get back into the game. But here comes Thiago Saporito with his 4th land, and that means Gideon. And we see this combination of Nissa and Gideon that we saw in game 2. Just a hugely, hugely powerful combination. Nissa now adding +1/+1 counters to each of those tokens, including the knight that Gideon just made.
Yeah, so Brian Kibler very much on the back foot here. Even though he's managed to sort out his mana woes, he still needs to worry about the fact that there's just a mass of creatures on the board. And having an extra land on top there for Innistrad Den Wildborn, able to play a second land each turn, very relevant here, because if he can get up to Dragonlord Ataka mana, then he's going to be in great shape. In the meantime, though, Thiago Saporito doing everything he can to simply race over the top, around the sides, and every which way, and Gideon immediately sacrificing himself to create an emblem. So actually, each of these creatures gigantic here. And a second Nissa, enough to elicit the handshake there. Brian Kibler can do nothing about just a hugely, hugely aggressive draw from Thiago Saporito's green-white tokens deck.
Yeah, very, very impressive showing out of that green-white deck. Unfortunately, we didn't really get to see the best of Brian Kibler's deck. Hopefully, we'll check in on him later on in the day, and we can see his deck maybe performing a little bit better than we did see here.
But, I mean, good news for Magic fans. We have plenty more Magic here in your feature match area. You can see there both Ben Friedman up against Dan Lathier on our King of the Hill table. They're still going. Also, Paul Chion and Matej Zalkai are working their way towards a 3rd game, I believe. So we're going to get a chance to look in on the one match that we've not seen anything from yet in this constructed portion here in round 4. That being King of the Hill. There we see Ben Friedman challenging to get the throne up against Dan Lathier. Now we have another Bant Collected Company deck here, but this time against blue-white humans. Tell us a little bit about humans in this standard format, Ian.
So humans it's sort of the classic white weenie archetype, but it's called humans because it does have some powerful synergies involving that creature type, namely Thalia's Lieutenant. Hugely powerful new 2-drop human from Shadows over Innistrad. It puts +1/+1 counters on each of your humans when it enters the battlefield, and when other humans enter the battlefield after it gets +1/+1 counters on itself. So really the centerpiece of these decks.
I must say that I love the design on Thalia's Lieutenant. It's one of those cards that it represents a little bit of a puzzle in terms of, do you play it first so that it's getting lots of counters going on itself whenever you play a human, or do you hold it until last in order to pump your entire team? Right now, we see a turn 1 Town Gossip Number from Ben Friedman. This is a deck that runs a lot of 1-drops, so no big surprises that he's able to deploy one on the first turn. And it doesn't take much for the Town Gossip Monger to flip. And when you see a transformed Town Gossip Monger, you see all sorts of trouble heading your way. There we see the Incited Rabble. It has to attack each turn, but being able to pump means that this 2/3 can really present some problems for opponents trying to figure out how they want to block.
Mm-hmm.
The Bant Collected Company deck, another one of the sort of fairly classic decks in this admittedly fairly young format, able to leverage some of the more powerful spells from Dragons of Tarkir, along with a few new little tricks.
Yeah, for those who haven't been following the standard scene leading up to the Pro Tour, these 2 decks that we're watching right here are sort of the boogeymen of the format. They're the level 1 decks that have been doing really well in the Star City Open and other preliminary tournaments. But, you know, with big targets on their head, it looks like a lot of other teams have brought decks that are sort of aimed at taking down these 2.
It looks like Ben Friedman's got one of those draws that can potentially just steamroll almost anyone. The triple 1-drop draw, his Kythion Hero of Akros, potentially able to transform very early indeed. And respect there from Dan Lathier. He says, I've got a Reflector Mage. I do not want to have to worry about that Kythion flipping. As it stands, though, Kythion will not be becoming a Planeswalker. We instead see it bounced, but just before it does, all of a sudden we have a Rabble on the board from Ben Friedman, which can actually attack into even the 2/3 Reflector Mage, assuming that Ben is willing to spend 2 mana on pumping its power.
Yeah, and that's one of the main strengths of this Humans deck, is that it really can just shrug off a Reflector Mage very easily. Most of its creatures cost 1 mana. It often has, you know, it floods the battlefield with many, many creatures all at once, and it can often spend its mana in other ways rather than, you know, even though it can't replay the same creature that was hit by Reflector Mage, it'll have plenty of other things to do with its mana early in the game.
Now, looking at Friedman's hand, there are a couple of interesting spells in this deck. I mean, a lot of White Weenie decks you kind of think of as being typified by the creatures, but actually some of the spells in this deck are very important to the mix. Griff's Boon is not a card that I necessarily, when I first saw it, really appreciated quite how powerful it is, but talk us through all of the things that are going on with that card.
Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty innocuous here. This is a card that a lot of people even dismissed in Limited early on, but just the ability to give your small creatures flying without the loss of card advantage. Really, Tim, the main reason why people eschew auras in Constructed is just the loss of card advantage there. If I put an aura on my creature and you kill it with a removal spell, I'm down 2 cards and you're only down 1. But with Griff's Boon, you can just bring it back from the graveyard onto another creature again. And the evasion just being so important in these aggressive small white creature decks, because often blocking with big creatures is traditionally a really, really good way to fight these kinds of decks. But all of a sudden, when your creatures can take to the sky with this recurring enchantment, it makes it really difficult to defend yourself by blocking with creatures.
Now, looking at Dan Landier's hand here, there's an interesting thing going on. Most of the Bant Collected Company decks, in my experience, have been a little bit weak to flyers. You don't tend to see so many creatures in the air, and that meaning that Griff's Boon potentially very powerful. But we see in Dan's hand there is an Eldrazi Sky Spawner, and that potentially a very important feature in this matchup. We saw there a Collected Company, I want to say kind of a swing and a miss here, only hitting a Death Mist Raptor. Ideally, this deck does want to be hitting 2 creatures, and it tends to play a very high creature ratio in order to achieve that. So Dan probably not as happy as he could be about how that particular play went.
Yeah, it's a very good point about the creature ratio, Tim. These Collected Company decks often want to be starting around 25 creatures or so, plus the 4 Collected Companies. So that's already 29 of your non-land cards, which only leaves room for a few spells. So you can pepper in things like Declaration Stone or Dromoka's Command or maybe Ojutai's Command to kind of round out your deck, but you don't have a lot of flexibility in terms of your spell slots.
Yeah, and that applies just as much to sideboarding as it does to the main deck. And one of the things that I've seen players get scuppered a little bit with is bringing in lots more spells for the sideboarded games and ultimately weakening their Collected Companies to the point that they're just playing a regular creature deck.
Absolutely.
So we see some swings here from Ben Friedman, who's looking to press his advantage. I mean, one interesting thing for me about the the white human decks is the range that they can occupy in terms of levels of aggression. Some of them can have a very low to the ground plan with lots and lots of 1-drops. Others can be a little bit more controlling, and some of the blue lists that I've seen actually top out at Dragonlord Ojutai and similar, which mean that they can fight a longer game if they need to. But right now, Ben Friedman very keen to just get damage in when he can.
And we do have Dan Lanthier pondering his options here. He has that Eldrazi Sky Spawner, which is a really interesting addition here to fight flying creatures or creatures enchanted with Griff's Boon. But his mana being a little awkward here. He does have Tragic Arrogance, but not the 5th land to cast it this turn. His 5th land being Evolving Wilds, which sort of enters the battlefield tapped.
Eldrazi Sky Spawner does provide effectively an extra mana source, so what we may be able to see coming from Dan here is a potential Tragic Arrogance with an immediate follow-up of some creature. Ben transforms once again. It sounds like we've got a game 3 going on our back table between Matej Zalkai and Paul Chion. Matej did win, of course, that first game, so potentially going to get a chance to jump back there. But in the meantime, Ben Friedman trying to find a way of squaring things up against Dan Lanthier, our reigning king of the hill. You see there Ben Friedman proudly wearing the hoodie of Team East-West Bowl. That the team that really broke out at the last Pro Tour as JC Tao won the entire Pro Tour with a deck featuring an Eldrazi Sky Spawner. That being modern, of course, this standard. And more big swings here coming in from Ben Friedman after a Silk Wrap clears the path of that slightly awkward Death Miss Raptor.
Yep.
Death Touch being pretty powerful when you've got a bunch of creatures that simply have to attack against it.
So 3 creatures entering the red zone here. That does mean Gideon will transform at the end of combat if he does survive, and he's likely to survive, of course, because of his activated ability that can make him indestructible. So we'll see how Dan decides to line up blocks. Looks like putting Reflector Mage in front of the Kithian means that Ben will be forced to at least spend mana to activate that indestructible ability.
Yeah, I mean, the other main option available to Ben Friedman would be to simply use his mana to pump through additional damage on one of his Incited Rabbles. It looks like, at the moment, the best place for him to spend mana would be, well, he's got options. He can either ensure that his Incited Rabble kills off Reflector Mage, or have Kithian stay alive. And it looks like Kithian flipping into Gideon was the option that he was most interested in. Planeswalker on board, certainly something that's powerful, even in spite of the flyer that Dan Lanthier has on the other side of things. Lanthier now on just 10 life.
Taking a look at that transformed version of Gideon Battleforged there.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of the +2 ability, almost kind of the classic Gideon ability back from the original Gideon Jura card, forcing a creature to attack Gideon. Obviously, if you have a blocker, that can be fairly powerful. You can also make one of your creatures indestructible and block it if you so choose. And for 0 loyalty, Gideon Battleforge becomes a 4/4 with indestructible.
This creature is obliged to attack Gideon. Yep.
All right, it looks like +2 is the direction that Gideon went. 5 loyalty, and now Dan Lanthier will not be able to hold all of his creatures back on defense. At least one of them is going to be stuck attacking. And that really favors Ben Friedman here, because it means he can simply apply more attacks himself. But with 2 transformed Incited Rabbles here, a Declaration in Stone might be a powerful play from Dan, killing off 2 creatures with just the 1 spell and netting an aura. Unable to fully kill off Gideon, but this Declaration in Stone, I'm sure he's not going to mind too much giving Ben Friedman 2 clues, because that exchange still well in his favor.
Yeah, huge play there from Dan Lanthier. Really cutting down on Ben Friedman's aggression there.
And Deathmiss Raptor, a perfectly fine blocker in this case. No interest in playing it face down to potentially Megamorph later, get back other creatures from the graveyard, because that other Deathmiss Raptor, it has been exiled with Silk Wrap. At least for the time being, we are not going to see that in this game. There's a Declaration in Stone in Friedman's hand also, and that a lovely answer to the Death Miss Raptor that Dan Lathier has going on. Always watching, though, another very powerful card from Shadows over Innistrad that may be tempting at some point if Ben Friedman can get some more creatures on the board. There we see it. Non-token creatures getting +1/+1 and Vigilance. And Vigilance, one of those abilities that I think when I first looked at Always Watching, I had perhaps undervalued. It just makes racing so difficult for any opponent.
Definitely true, Tim. So the trouble here for Ben is that right now his Gideon is really his only offense on board, but he doesn't have a good way to protect it. I mean, he can play the Always Watching and attack with the Gideon, but then Gideon's simply going to die on the attack back from Dan. So Ben just thinking about his options here, and unfortunately with Dan at 10 life, it really is going to be on Ben to find another creature that he can stick and maybe enchant with the Griff Spoon to close out the game.
Well, it looks like he's going with the Declaration in Stone for now, just to kind of stem the bleeding a little bit. He gives his opponent a clue, but again, the clue's a small price to pay in pretty much every exchange involving Declaration in Stone. And Hanway Militia Captain being the follow-up there. That a powerful one on both sides of things, really, and on the draws where the white deck ends up with a lot of creatures in play, which is very, very easy to happen. The transformed Hanway Militia Captain being as large as all of the creatures you have in play and pumping out tokens on its own. I mean, it doesn't take too much to become very powerful indeed.
Yeah, I actually like that addition to Ben's deck a lot. We haven't seen Hanway Militia Captain show up that frequently in these decks. It's often something that's either in small numbers or not present at all. But in a metagame where you're expecting lots of other White Weenie decks and Bant Company decks, there's not a lot of removal going around. These decks are very creature heavy, and so having something like a Hanway Militia Captain to just go over the top in these creature mirror matches makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, Always Watching, of course, a great pairing for the Hanway Militia Captain too. It doesn't really take too much to get things going there. But Landier's hand basically on the board at this point. Reflector Mage doing great work about trying to keep Ben Friedman off the aggressive plan he wants to be on. And Eldrazi Sky Spawner coming in the air. That Tragic Arrogance at the moment wouldn't even be particularly favorable for Dan, but a lovely backup to have. Village Gossip Monger there, the play for Ben Friedman. And Knight of the White Orchid, carefully counting the lands here, Ben Friedman, trying to work out if he's going to be able to score an additional land. It looks like there's 6 in play for both players, so that Knight of the White Orchid, just a 2/2 first strike, but first strike gets very powerful, especially once you start layering it up with other abilities like Vigilance. You just have a creature that's a nightmare in combat no matter which way you slice it.
Was that a Collected Company off the top, it looks like, for Dan?
Yeah, functionally drawing, I guess, kind of 2 cards and a little bit of a discount. But just a little update for you from our back tables. Paul Cheon was able to defeat Matali Zadalkai 2-1. So great news for the Channel Fireball team in the feature match area here. Both Luis Scott Vargas and Paul Cheon currently undefeated. Are we potentially setting up for another Cheon LSV match in the feature match area sometime in this tournament? I mean, I'm sure that they don't really want to play each other, except for the fact that if they do, it means they're both doing really well.
So this looks like a main phase Collected Company here from Dan.
I mean, there's a lot of good potential hits for him here, depending on the exact list that he's working with. A Bounding Crisis to tap down some of those creatures, get a few extra hits in, could be kind of nice. Looks like there might be a Sylvan Advocate at the top of things there, and with 6 lands in play, that one of the bigger creatures you can ever realistically hit. And Lamholt Pacifist, well, with 6 lands in play, that's a 3/3 that can attack, because that Sylvan Advocate just large enough to be able to mean that it's not going to worry about finding a creature with 4 power in play. Big swings there, and another Sylvan Advocate. And with Lumbering Falls tucked away in the land section of Dan Lathier's board, that Lumbering Falls is going to be an absolutely massive threat if it ever gets activated. Naturally transforms into a 3/3 blue-green elemental with hexproof when you pay 4 mana. But with 2 copies of Sylvan Advocate in play, well, a 7/7 is just not something that Ben Friedman's deck is well equipped to deal with.
So Ben thinking about his options here. This could be his very last turn of the game. He has the Griff Spoon in his graveyard. So that can give him 3 points of flying power on one of his Knight of the White Orchid, that is. Doesn't look like he has many other ways to pump up his team. He has the Always Watching, that's a 4th point, but that puts him short of Dan Lanthier's 6-point life total.
Anointer of Champions, an interesting one in this particular White Humans list that I've not seen in many of the White Humans lists. Interesting to see whether or not there's going to be time for that to really impact this board. Hanway Watch Captain coming down there for Ben Friedman, who's just kind of trying to find a way of stabilizing, as that collected company really did change the face of this board substantially. Always Watching is now in play. So all of Ben Friedman's creatures are larger, +1/+1 and Vigilance. Might as well get that Anointer of Champions in play. There's not even a particularly exciting swing here from Ben Friedman, though. Those 2 copies of Sylvan Advocate, absolutely gigantic. And at this point, it's a rearguard action for Ben Friedman, in spite of the fact that he's the one leading on life. Lanthia, Tragic Arrogance, the card that's been sat in his hand for basically the whole game, effectively is a kind of a safety blanket for him, because he has been able to find a way of not needing to deploy it on the way that these board has sat, thanks in large part to collected company, meaning that he's constantly had creatures in play. But it looks like now is the time. Tragic Arrogance getting cast, and Dan Lanthia gets to pick his best creature to keep in play and Ben Friedman's worst. And this is the point where casting that Anointer of Champions perhaps looks a little worse, because that the creature that Dan Lanthia chooses to leave in play. He's going to leave the Always Watching, which means that Silk Wrap goes away, so Deathmist Raptor is back. A big swing for 4 here coming in from Sylvan Advocate, and suddenly this game is 6 points of life each, but Dan Lanthia with the commanding board state. Ben Friedman there with Thalia's Lieutenant coming down, pumping Anointer of Champions once more. It now a 3/3 with Vigilance, but when there's a 3/3 with Death Touch, oh, Griff Spoon coming in, so 3-4 points coming in the air. We've got a race on our hands, but I don't think it's a race that... I mean, I guess that there's only one flyer on the board.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking back to that Tragic Arrogance turn. I mean, that was definitely a conservative play on Dan's part. I mean, Dan, I think, had the stronger board at that point. He's just making sure that, you know, Ben didn't assemble something with Griff Spoon and maybe a top deck that could present lethal there. But
this is a nice set of swings for Dan Lanthia. He had the option, I believe he drew a collected company, but right now he just wants to make sure that that Anointer of Champions gets off the board. And this is a board where a single block will not be good enough, so it is going to have to block and trade with something. Lumbering Falls is a 5/5, a 3/3 Deathmist Raptor, and a 4/5 Sylvan Advocate.
So this is a 4/3, and that's a 5/5. Yeah,
Ben Friedman just making sure that he understands exactly how large all the creatures on the board are, because in total, the only creature that has the power and toughness that is listed on the card is that Deathmist Raptor. All of the others getting assorted bonuses based on various bits of game text going on.
yeah, it looks like Ben's only reasonable block here is to chump the Lumbering Falls and trade with the Deathmist Raptor, which puts him in a pretty bad board state after that. But I don't see anything else that he can do.
All right.
Seems that Ben agrees. He's going to be dropping to 2 on this attack.
1, 2.
I mean, he's killing this.
Yeah.
Death Touch, and then so you take 4, you're at 2.
So now we're in a position where basically any creature in Dan Landier's deck is lethal. Many of them are massively over-lethal in terms of attacking, and there are no creatures in play for Ben Friedman. He draws his card for the turn. Is it going to turn this around? It needs to be something fairly substantial. He quickly passes back to Dan Landier, who has no reason to do much more than simply activate his Lumbering Falls and swing in here. Safer to have 2 attackers rather than 1, but he looks like Eldrazi Skyspawn his choice. And that being because he can sacrifice the Skyspawn Eldrazi Scion token, activate his 2 creatures attack, and there's the handshake. So our King of the Hill remaining in the feature match area for at least one more round. Congratulations to Dan Landier there. 2-0 against Ben Friedman, and 4-0 so far here at Pro Tour Shadows over Innistrad. So that is the conclusion of our first round of the constructed portions here at Pro Tour Shadows over Innistrad. I'm Tim Willoughby here with R&D member Ian Duke, and we're just beginning to get a snifter of some of the things that we might see from Shadows over Innistrad in this standard format. This must be a very exciting time for you in R&D. You've designed all these cards, but now they're out in the wild. How are you feeling?
Great so far. I mean, the tournament's looking awesome. The limited portion was great, and Constructed is off to a great start. I think we're a little bit apprehensive about the White Weenie deck and Bant Company coming into the tournament, but looking through the deck list and looking at what we saw in that round, I'm really excited about what's to come.
Well, plenty more to come here from Pro Tour Shadows over Innistrad. We'll be back in commentary for round 5, soon enough. But for now, let's head things across to the news desk.
Thanks very much, Tim. Thanks very much, Ian. This is the view from the news desk. Why don't we take a look at the view from our Skycam high overhead, the tables out there on the floor. There you go. You start to get a sense of who's still going. As you see, players mostly finished. We've got about 15 matches still left. And there in the distance with our roving cam, I recognize a Brian David Marshall. And who's that on the east and who's that on the west? Let's find out.
Thanks, Rich. I'm here with Team East West Bowl members Andrew Brown and newest member, world champion Seth Mainfield. Andrew, it's been kind of a whirlwind for you guys. You came to the last Pro Tour somewhat under the radar. Sure. You have a breakout tournament. What's it been like since the Pro Tour?
Ever since the Pro Tour, we've tried to kind of be more formal about things. We got a house, we tested formally, and kind of all showed up with the same deck, which is much different than last time.
So you added some players. You had Seth Mainfield. What's that like from your perspective, having a world champion join the team?
I mean, it's outrageous. It's just like being able to just ask someone who you know will just come up with a great answer is really nice to have, and just limited, constructed, everything. It just makes it a whole lot easier.
What about you, Seth? What was it like joining this team, and how did you feel like you fit in with this group of guys?
I'm happy to be on the team. A lot of the players are actually close by to me, so I was familiar with a lot of the group, and then I think I made quick friends with some of the other players from the west side. Obviously, I'm east, so it's sort of half and half, essentially, but it's worked out well. I think we've gelled pretty well. There's a good number of us now, but happy with. We played a lot. We played a ton of Magic going into this tournament, both online and then once we got here. So can't complain with how it's been going.
Now, I know a couple of people have talked about how fast this format has gotten in Limited. You played a somewhat slower deck in Limited to a 3-0 finish.
Yeah, I saw Rise from the Tides, and I was just like, okay, I'm just taking all these spells. I'm going blue-red. I hadn't drafted the deck before, but I knew a bunch of people that had done really well with it, and it felt amazing when I played it. You have Madness cards, you have card draw, you have removal, and you don't really even need that many creatures, so it was great.
Okay, and one of the big changes for this Pro Tour, Andrew, is the new gear. We've got our model, Eric Severson, showing off. There we go, a little East-West Bold hoodie.
Blue and red.
Turn around here. Let's take a look at the back. We got the number, the name. This is pretty sweet, pretty exciting. Is there like an East-West Bowl site for gear?
Not right now, but we are color-coded, so if you're from the west side, you're blue, and if you're from the east side, you're red.
All right, you know how to tell them apart. It's East-West Bowl. We're going to see how they do this weekend, following up on their tremendous Pro Tour earlier this year. Brian David Marshall sending it back to Rich Hagon at the desk.
If you're east, you're blue. If you're orange, if you're red, you're in the... That is way, way too much fashion thought for a Magic the Gathering Pro Tour. East-West Bowl there with Brian David Marshall. All right, well, we're at 4-0, so that means we start with 400 players roughly at 0-0. So you halve it each round, 200, 100, 50. Now, round about 25 perfect records, or at least there will be once those last few matches are done. Here are some names who are 4-0. John Finkel, he defeated Jason Chung in this round. Yuya Nakamura, the man with two famous names, but neither of them go together. Yuya Nakamura over Marcio Carvalho, 4-0. Chris Calcano with Bank Company is 4-0 over Yuki Ichikawa. Yelga Vigasma, the Hall of Famer, is 4-0. Valentin Mackel has gone from his 3-0 limited limited deck into a win in the first round of Constructed. So Seth Manfield, who you've just seen there, Kentaro Yamamoto of Japan, Yuki Matsumoto of Japan, Petar Sahurek, who a lot of us have been saying early on, if he could do well in limited, big sign, because he is one of the top relatively unheralded Constructed players right now. Shota Yasuoka 4-0, Brad Nelson the same, and Katsuhiro Mori, the 2005 world champion, is 4-0. More results coming in, but right now it's time to start getting under the hood of what's going on in Shadows over Innistrad Standard. It's time for our first deck tech. Here's Randy Buehler with Andrea Mengucci.